50 years since Selma and the signing of the Voting Rights Act. What has changed and what hasn't? We have a panel of experts to discuss that question, and then we'll take questions from you, the audience. The host for our conversation, called From Selma to Ferguson, is Emmy Award-winning reporter and former anchor at KPIX TV. Please welcome Miss Barbara Rodgers.
Thank you, and good afternoon. How is everybody? Good, good, good. And I'm happy to see you here on this observance of Martin Luther King Day. How many of you have already seen the movie Selma? Just raise your hand. So probably about a third, it looks like about 2/3 haven't. Of those of you who have seen it, how many of you believe that it was about 90 to 95% accurate? Okay, well, surprisingly, there are some people who think it was dramatization and that this really didn't happen in this way to so many black people in the South. In fact, a friend of mine had a conversation with me over the weekend, and she said one of her white friends had asked her, was that really true? And she said this friend, who is white, is dating a black man, and the black man had said to her, I didn't get the Oprah Winfrey character. What was that all about? So I thought, well, they didn't get the movie because it was all about their right to vote. But this is the problem that we are so often up against, is that in America, so many people do not know or understand our history and do not know why things are the way they are today, because that history still affects us today and probably will still be affecting us into the future. So today we're going to talk about From Selma to Ferguson, how that history still is being played out on the streets of our cities. To help us with that discussion, we have a distinguished panel, and I'm going to introduce them, and I'll ask you to hold your applause until I've introduced all the panelists. First is Dr. Dwight Hopkins, a professor of religion at the University of Chicago. Dr. Hopkins is a constructive theologian working in the areas of contemporary models of theology, various forms of liberation theologies, especially black and other third world manifestations, and east-west cross-cultural comparisons. He is also an African-American Baptist minister. Dr. Hopkins.
Thank you.
Next is, if you'd hold your applause to the end, we'll applaud for all of them at once. Next is Andrew Aydin. He is a congressional aide to Congressman John Lewis, U.S. Representative from Georgia, and of course a central figure in the civil rights movement. Mr. Aydin is also co-author with Congressman Lewis of the #1 New York Times best-selling graphic novel, March, Book 1. He is currently serving as digital director and policy advisor to Representative Lewis in Washington, D.C. And our final panelist is Dr. James Braxton Peterson, the Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of English at Lehigh University, and a frequent media contributor on MSNBC, CBS, and CNN. He is also the founder of Hip Hop Scholars Incorporated, an association of hip hop generational scholars dedicated to researching and developing the cultural and educational potential of hip hop, urban, and youth cultures. Please welcome our panelists with your applause. So, gentlemen, as I watched that movie, Selma, I was struck by the comparisons between some of the things that are going on in the streets today. But I also thought about, because I am a child of the South, I grew up in the South during that whole movement, I also thought about how different the country is now than it was then. And it seems to me that it's a lot harder now to get some of the things done, to make some of the changes, than it was then, although I'm sure as we look at that Selma movie, it was pretty hard for them too. Is that just my perception, or is it harder now to get past the attitudes that people have today? And why don't we start with you, Andrew, because you have worked on sort of looking at both the history and the current through the work that you've been doing with Congressman Lewis.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here. You know, I work in Congress, which is if you're not working for John Lewis, it's not a fun place to be right now. There is no way the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act could get through this Congress. I have no doubt about that. We tweeted that actually about a year ago, and some people got very, very upset, and we said, okay, well then why don't you pass immigration reform? Take on a big challenge, pass something. And just the other day, Representative Goodlatte said that he didn't think it was necessary to repair the damage that was done to the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. So unfortunately, this Congress is more about obstruction than progress. That is a sad commentary. Do you agree, Dr. Peterson?
I do agree. I think, generally speaking, I mean, I try to keep things a little bit separate. I mean, the civil rights movement was such a powerful movement with so many different leaders, and although there is some overlap, there are some important issues that we should think about that are sort of comparable and consistent with what we're dealing with today. I think we still need to honor that moment for the history that it was in. But certainly when you think about the Voting Rights Act, when you think about across the country, you know, legislatures are implementing all kinds of things: voter ID, ending souls to the polls, shortening the time in which people can vote. There are a lot of political forces that are trying to disenfranchise mostly poor people, elderly folk, and people of color. And so being confronted with that and watching a film like Selma is this really strange thing. You know, and I don't want to spoil too much of the film, but that character that Oprah Winfrey is playing is Annie Lee Cooper. That's a very important moment in the film, but also a very, very important moment for us, because that's a moment that gets elided in the civil rights movement. Not a lot of people understand exactly what folk like Annie Lee Cooper had to do and what they were prepared to do to vote. We need that energy in this moment so that young people can understand why we're out here in the streets and why it's so important for us to be here. And so I think there's a lot of comparative analyses that we should do, but we have to honor the civil rights movement for what it was and not allow the achievements of that moment prevent us from moving forward and continuing the work that we have to do now.
Dr. Hopkins?
Yes, no, thank you. I would just like to add just a footnote. Actually, like you, I was born in the South. I was born in segregation, born in the colored hospital, went to segregated schools, and then my father wanted me to have a northern education, so he sent me to Boston.
Cultural shock?
Yeah, definitely. I think when we look back at that time, my experience, the thing that impressed me most was that everybody was in one community, and you saw examples of what success could be. That's very important in terms of modeling, particularly I'm talking about young people. Two, our education system was set up in such a way that all the educators, obviously they were black, they affirmed our humanity. They made sure we studied, but they kept saying, you are somebody. And one day, when that door opens, you're not going to just crack it, you're going to bust that door down. So we had role models who cared about us. We had teachers who we spent a lot of our times every day, you know, at school, who affirmed our humanity. And the third thing that impressed me was that it was local community organizing, block by block, you know, district by district, which allowed a lot of us to move into the desegregated area. I wouldn't say we're integrated, we were desegregated. So I think one of the lessons, or several of the lessons that's good for young folk today, is to realize that Dr. King was only 39 years old when he was assassinated. So to me, he was a young boy looking back now at my age. But what that says is that in such a short lifetime, young people, one, are the future. Young people should see themselves as the future, and young people should conduct and organize their lives as if they are the future. And they have to be affirmed by the older generation. Let them be young and exercise the energy and power and creativity, and I always say craziness, that the youth have in them.
There are a number of people, and you talked about how, as we were growing up, we were in segregated communities and segregated schools. Now, people can go to integrated schools, integrated restaurants, ride on the bus. But there are still people who say that we are going backwards and that we really have not made that much progress. Sometimes I get into arguments with people about that, because we'll be having that argument in a very nice restaurant where I couldn't have gone back in 1959. I wonder how you feel about that. Do you get the sense sometimes, as you are out there still on what would be the front lines today, I guess, do you get that sense that we haven't gone very far, or what do you feel?
I mean, for me, I think this is a conversation you're having is extremely important, because one of the dirty little secrets about the segregation era was the kind of solidarity, both in terms of education, in terms of economics, that existed in black communities prior to desegregation. I did a research project in the city of Durham pre-segregation, where a black person could basically do anything in the black community. Dollars were circulated in that community over and over and over again. That just doesn't happen right now in the African American community. And so but it's very complicated. I'm a tenured professor at a predominantly white elite institution. I can't stand here before you and say nothing has changed. That's not absolutely accurate. But I think one of the challenging things for us in this moment is that there's all of this tremendous, exceptional black success. You got Oprah Winfrey, you have Barack Obama, you have the Attorney General, you have a Supreme Court Justice, you have rappers and entertainers. There's a lot of black exceptionalism. And what the challenge for us is to make sure that those figures don't obscure for us the pain and suffering of the masses of black folk in this country. And so, yes, there's been progress, right? Thank you. There's been progress, and we have all these great sort of exceptional figures to look to indicate that. But we just can't allow that to obscure for us the fact that income inequality is growing dramatically. The housing crisis for America was terrible for America. It was awful for the black community, right? The recession was pretty bad for America. It was awful for the black community. So we still have a lot of work to do, and we can't allow success to prevent us from seeing what that work is.
So, Dr. Hopkins, are we doing the work? Have those of us who have made it, quote unquote, out and up, have we forgotten that there are, as Dr. Peterson says, all those other people who are still struggling? Or are we doing what we can?
Yeah, I think part of it is, what we define as doing all we can. I think folks are doing things at various levels, but I can give myself as an example. I actually work on the south side of Chicago, go to a church there, and they're a group of black professionals. We call it the men's group, which no one has never heard about until now. But I joined in 1998. The group started in 1985, and now we're old and gray-haired grandparents. But what we do is that we do a lot of the local grassroots stuff in a region we've defined to focus there. We've got doctors, lawyers, bankers, professors, all professional men, family folks. And so I always try to look for that small group of folk who don't always get the attention of the media, and to see what they're doing. And then what we do is we try to connect our energy with elected officials, et cetera. So try to be a bridge from below up to those who have a very important power, economic power, political power, judicial power, all of those things. So to me, I think it's like an elephant. So we're all trying to do things from different angles. But the only point I just want to come back, particularly to young folk out there, is that it's that energy from below that they bring, and where they, like SNCC, right? It's that energy, the fire. That's the fire. And again, Dr. King died at 39, so how old was he in 1955? And he created his own momentum and energy with Rosa Parks and Diane Nash and all those other young people, and the Honorable John Lewis, obviously, a very unique person who's still focused, which is another thing. Are we still focused? But those young people came together and made a decision that this was their time. This was their time. So I also used to be a community organizer in Harlem, so I got all kinds of hats going on, right? And a community organizer has to do several things. That is, 1, live with the people. 2, help them fashion the vision that they want. 3, give them the tools to carry out that vision. And 4, help them feel, this is the intangible, that they make history. Young people make history, and that's successful community organizing.
When you did and I described it as a graphic novel, and some people might think that means 50 Shades of Grey, but a graphic novel in the sense that we're talking about here is actually a comic book. That's what they call a comic book nowadays, that is not about comedy or about Little Lulu and all those ones we used to read, but about serious topics like the civil rights movement. So in your comic, I'll call it a comic book so everybody knows what we're talking about, in the comic book that you've just done with Congressman Lewis, is that what your aim was, to really get to the young people in a medium that they might better understand or might be more inclined to pick up and read?
Absolutely. I wrote my graduate thesis on a comic book that was used in the late 50s by Dr. King, by A. Philip Randolph, by Jim Lawson, to inspire some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience during the sit-ins. And when the congressman told me about this comic book that he himself remembered reading, it was called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. It was 16 pages, it sold for 10 cents. It was an introduction into Gandhian nonviolence. And it spread all across the South. And it was used to motivate these young people, to draw them into the movement. And so when the congressman and I started working on March, our graphic novel series, that was at the forefront of our mind. Because the congressman is so conscious of how important the young people are to the movement. He was chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at 23. He was a speaker at the March on Washington at 23. He was 25 when he led the march on Bloody Sunday. They were the driving force in many respects. As I look at it, I serve as his digital director, so I handle his social media, I handle telecom technology policy, sort of the tip of the spear in many ways for communications these days, and also for organizing. As I look at it, I think young people both have tremendous advantages in the form of social media, but they also face tremendous challenges in the form of student loans. When John Lewis was 28 years old, he married his wife, Lillian. And his wedding announcement in the LA Times read, Lillian Miles to wed unemployed political activist John Lewis. People who are ahead of their time face a true price. They're often unable to find jobs. In this country, we have to resuscitate the activist class. And we have to do away with student loans, which is why I think what President Obama did, making community colleges free, is so important. But there is still more to do. I mean, we have $2 trillion in student loan debt in this country. It is the next debt bubble, the next housing crisis. If we don't address that now, we will never create that activist class of generation that will, in effect, save us from ourselves.
One of the things that we see in the movie Selma and that we see in any of the documentaries done about the civil rights movement is that there were leaders, and really a central leader in Martin Luther King. Today, I think if you ask young people or anybody who is the leader of what the movement is today and what is its goal, what are its strategies, I think you might get a lot of different answers because I don't think we have them. Do you think we actually need a central leader? For example, as we've seen the protests that have arisen out of what happened in Ferguson and in New York and in several other places around the country, there's been no one person who everybody could look at and say, that's somebody who's organizing this and making some kind of strategy so that around the country we're all moving toward the same thing. Do we actually need that, or is it fine the way it's going with people having protests that spring up here and there?
Yeah, I think what's a good thing that's going on today is that we have multiple leaders. We just don't have one central leader. And we have two of them right here. We've got leaders in the political and digital comic books. I know that like you, comic books. We got someone in MSBC and academic Africana research. These are all leaders. And I think this is the beauty of those who have come after the generation where we were born in, where they feel that they are the leaders. And so we multiply our definition and vision of leadership. So when there, unfortunately, will be another loss of a Martin Luther King, then we emerge, there's a whole nother wave, and I think that's very, very important. I have a daughter who, I was out here in Oakland before I went to Chicago, so she's born and raised, and she lives in Oakland. And when President Bush was invading Iraq in 2003 in the spring, she called me, and I said, what are you doing? It's like 12 o'clock, aren't you in school? She says, we're opening the schools in Oakland, and we're marching down to City Hall. That's the spirit of the new leadership. Of course, those who are elder, who are still around, have experience, there are certain things that they/we can do because of historical circumstances. But we've got to be that shell, that guide, that resources, so there's emerging, let 100 flowers blossom, let 100 forms of leadership emerge in the young generation.
So do we need a coherent strategy?
Well, I think we do, and I agree that the model of like the sort of singular, rhetorically gifted, charismatic black male leader is really kind of a myth when you look closely at the history. I mean, there are always groups of people working there, but it's just that the way that we have to remember history requires us to have like singular male leaders, and so I think the people of this generation, they don't reject that necessarily. They just have moved beyond it, like you said. And there's a proliferation of things. Now, you can look to certain organizations, like if you look at the Ferguson Action Organization, if you look at the Justice League, you look at the Dream Defenders, or the Dreamers, both of those, there are leaders in those organizations, and those organizations, not only are they organized, not only do they have a strategy, but they are communicating across regions. What you've been seeing with the black brunches, with the die-ins, with the sit-ins, with the marches, I know it doesn't look organized, but it is actually fairly well organized, and it is fairly well coordinated, and that's why it is national. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of young people that have been in the streets. They've shut down highways, they've shut down restaurants, and this has been going on for, I don't know, now over 6 months. It's been incredible. You have young people in the Bay Area. I just came from the Black Lives Matters conference in Arizona. We have young people all over Arizona organizing, doing sit-ins, die-ins, working with young people from around the country. So it is incredibly inspiring and exciting to see what is going on. But I think sometimes, even me, these are people younger than I am, and it didn't at first look like the movement that I thought it needed to be. But you know what? It's not about what we thought or what the historical blueprint was. It's about what young people are doing now, and I'm telling you, they are doing it.
So you feel they're being effective? Are they, in other words, is Congress listening?
Two different questions. I think on the one hand, we all know that it's happening, and that means that they're succeeding. But there is a difference between getting your message out and putting pressure on political officials. The Freedom Rides brought Robert Kennedy almost to his knees. He was begging these young activists, Diane Nash, Jim Farmer, to stop what they were doing. He said he was asking for a cooling off period, and Jim Farmer said, Mr. Attorney General, if we cool off anymore, we'll be in a deep, deep freeze. And what we're at now is a point where these organizations, which remind me very much in some cases of the Nashville Student Movement, which had no single leader, it had a rotating chairmanship. We have to take these disparate movements, much like the sit-ins were, where you had them in Greensboro and you had them in Nashville, you had them in Atlanta, and bring them together, much like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did, and nationalize it. But you also have to use organizations like CORE was, which organized the Freedom Rides, and then put the pressure on not just the president, but Congress. The March on Washington demonstrated that you could have hundreds of thousands of people peacefully march through the streets of Washington. You had the National Guard on alert. You had people terrified that this would be a violent uprising in some sense. They were afraid of riots. They were afraid of chaos and disorder. And what we have to do, and what we are trying to do by showing these lessons from the civil rights movements in the graphic novels, is showing young people how they once did make that transition from being young people with a message and with a voice to being a political force. It was John Lewis who was invited to the president to meet with the president along with the other leaders of the Big Six before the march or after the March on Washington. The young people need to have a voice, a seat at the table, but in order to do so, they're going to have to start adapting their tactics to truly scare some of these elected officials.
Just one quick quote.
Yeah.
The president was forced to meet with these activists.
Absolutely.
He did have to sit with them. And his response, in terms of getting some resources to police departments, body cameras to police departments, may not be the exact response that we wanted, but they've pretty much demonstrated that they can apply certain pressure. But I'm not sure if that is necessarily the end goal for some of these organizations. Like, I'm not sure if their end goal is to try to work through the political process or political system as it is. I think we have to kind of see what they're going to do. But I wouldn't underestimate their capacity to strategize and organize.
All right, now we're going to open it up for people in the audience to ask some questions. If you raise your hand, we have Marvin here with his microphone. So I believe there's someone back here in the middle. And please identify yourself and before you ask your question. And could you limit it to a question so that we can get as many in as possible?
Yes. Hello, panel. Thank you for being here. My name is Andre Dias. I have a question. It seems as if the African American community does not have an economic base. After the civil rights movement, it seemed to kind of dissipate. Is there anything that you can suggest for us to do now to teach the younger people how to spend their money in the community to build an economic base so that you can move forward in the society?
Yeah, it's a great question. One, I mean, we should be clear, there is an economic base. In fact, this year in 2015, the buying power of the African American community will reach $1 trillion. Right, 1 trillion with a T, right? So it will be the equivalent of like the 8th largest nation in the world, right? So there is a base. It's just that it's not consolidated. It's not used effectively. You know, it would take me a long time to tell you all the things that need to happen in order for some of those dollars to be circulated within our community more than once or twice. But I think the first step for young folk is to become more conscientious consumers. You know, we are very, very good at spending beyond our means, like black folk as a community, but we should understand that America is that way, right? America in general spends beyond its means, but that is more pronounced in our community because we have less disposable income and less wealth in our community. So when we're spending beyond our means, like most other Americans do, it actually hurts our community a little bit more. But we have to become more conscientious about how and where we're spending our money. And I know that's difficult for young people to do because they see something they like on TV or in a music video and they just want to go get it. But that is, I think, for me, the first step. This is a long process. There's no shortcut to what you're talking about. The first step to me is being more conscientious about how we consume. Because if we start to figure out how to consume in places that support our communities and consume in stores that don't exploit our workers and don't exploit our communities, then I think we'll take the first step at least towards the kind of economic solidarity you're talking about.
All right, thank you. Right here in the front row, second row.
Hi, my name is Daryl Rogers, and I'm a native San Franciscan, and I took part in the 1960 movement here in San Francisco. I was just a kid, and youth, yes, drove the movement. But my question is why is it that so many of us aren't asking the right questions? Many of us only ask the question of what is freedom without ever understanding that each individual of every generation must discover freedom for themselves. And until it's applied from the generational basis and understand that each of us can be the Martin Luther, because we've always been able to come up with the Martin Luthers of the world. We've always done that.
Who is your question directed at? Anybody who wants to answer?
Well, I kind of like the idea that education is a key element, because we've always talked about that, but it's never been necessary. It's never been the beat-all thing in order for the movement to start. So there are other elements that are there that need to really be looked at and not turned away, and that's the youth who are just out here struggling day by day and getting lost and dropped between the.
So I think if I'm accurate, he's saying, what can we do to address those youth, not just on the college campuses or in the high schools even, but the youth who are perhaps in the street, to get them to see their leadership potential?
Right, I think it's, the elephant issue that, we can't have a single approach and strategy or tactics. We have to play the piano, all the keys simultaneously. And I think that there are some progressive faith organizations in the United States who are trying to do that, particularly on a local level. That is to say that the question of what everyone's faith perspective isn't housed in a structure in a building, but actually begins outside the building in the streets. And that those who have need to also serve those who do not. So to be a human being is to serve others. To be a person of faith is to serve others. So that type of orientation for those so-called folk who are on the inside to share their resources with people on the outside, I think that's very, very important. The second thing I think that's important is that the folk who are in the streets, Chinene and Bo, it's the typical names we use, is that we have to realize that those people are geniuses. In fact, there's a comic book I heard yesterday on Genius.
Genius, that's
it's called
right.
Genius. So the
And she's
thing
supposed
is,
to be on this panel. We're
Yeah,
really sad she's not
she's
there.
telling her she's right across
She
the
had a
street.
10-person line, and you guys
Right.
can join it when we're
That's
when
an
we're done.
example of someone who has insights for the folks, the Shanae and Bows who are out, maybe been through juvie, had a little brush with the law, but those folks are geniuses. We have to perceive them as geniuses. If we perceive them as geniuses, then we can tap into the resources they have and also provide openings so they can practice their freedom in the form that's good for them. So as a person who was student organizer, community organizer, is ordained now, is a professor, global stuff, somebody did that for me. And we have to do the same thing for the young people. So those of us that are in have to use our resources, and those of us who are out, they have to be perceived as leaders, as geniuses.
Okay, and Genius, the comic book that he's talking about by Afua Richardson, she will be doing an interview over in the City View in the Metreon, and I'll be doing that interview with her a little later, so come over and listen. I think I saw a hand here, the woman who's standing here. Marvin, if you could get the mic to her.
Give it up for Marvin, everybody who's in here putting in the work with that microphone.
Good afternoon. My name is Marie Harrison, and like yourself, I've been a community organizer in my community, Bayview Hunters Point, for quite a while, and throughout California, through the Central Valley and such. But one of the questions that I have a many, but the one question I really would like to have you guys address really fast, if you can, is our generation has a tendency to raise their leaders up and keep them there for very prolonged times. And our young folks, we're losing them left and right. We're losing them mostly because people of our generation, we've, quote, led the march, beat the band, you know, taught everybody how to do everything and we don't know how to move aside. How do we get people my age, and if I have to, I'll tell you, but if I don't have to, I won't tell you how old I am. I guess my problem is that folks of our generation are not stepping aside and allowing someone younger to lead the way. We need to learn how to guide and stop trying to lead. And while I honestly appreciate all of the talent on the stage, trust and believe I do, you're missing one vital element for me. And this is something I learned from my daughter. While I don't stand up and tell her how to do and when to do, no, shut up now, and that kind of thing, she's learned how to lead the way and be very open and very predominant in the community doing what she loves. How do we get these young folks on this stage with you guys, not separate from you, but with you guys, trying to give them what they need in guidance, not leading them?
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to take that question?
All right. First of all, you're the most beautiful 29-year-old I have ever met. I think it is a problem that we have come to accept the helicopter activist, the one who sees a struggle happening, they get on their plane, they show up, they get in the front of the line, which is often segregated from most of the activists, the actual people doing the hard work, and they march, they get their photo, they get their airtime, and then they leave. And there is no indigenous youth leadership. One of the things I love so much about working for John Lewis is that you almost never see him do that. He's trying to work with the young people. That's why he's got a 31-year-old that he's allowing to be on stage speaking for him, which is probably a gamble. I mean, I could say anything right now. You never know. But that's who he is. And there's this whole cadre of folks that we have in Atlanta and all across the country who are doing that. I think you're speaking to a very important point, which is that we have to find a way not just to teach or mentor, but to empower. To say that, you know, I want to learn from you, the younger folks, right? You know, I convinced a sitting member of Congress to write a graphic novel, all right? He listened to me when I was 24. There needs to be a whole lot more of that. So I think you need to keep preaching, please.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I mean, I would just say that most of my work is working with young people, so I agree with you. I think that sometimes it's difficult to, we can't always think about these things as being separate, right? You're right, we need young people represented here, right? We got Marvin running around with the mic. Marvin could be sitting right over here. You know, I walked in here, Marvin was like, yo, I got saved, I'm ready to go to work. Seriously, like when I walked in the building, that's what he said. And so I think you're right. We need gender balance, we need age balance, all those things, but I mean, I'm committed to and doing that work every day of my life.
Okay. Marvin, I think we've got a guy who's standing for a long while with his hand up back there in the black jacket.
Good afternoon, distinguished panel. The premise of this march for Martin Luther King was for the voting right. I would like to see all these people marching the streets to come to the voting polls for this next election.
Yeah.
And vote. I was so disappointed in our last election. I worked the polls and have worked the polls for the past 10 years. I was so shocked to see the lack of the African American, the Latinos, the minorities in general. What can we do, and what would you do to encourage all of these young people who are 18 years old and able to vote to come to the voting polls for this year? Because if we don't vote for a Democrat president, the Republicans are going to do us in, take away all that this wonderful president we have has done for us. Please.
All right. All right. What's your, that is a dilemma that a lot of people talk about, is how do you get, especially in the off-year elections, when it's not a presidential election, how do you get people to understand how important it is to vote in those years?
Well, even if everybody showed up to an election, Democrats would have to win by 7 points to break even in the number of seats they had in the House. That's how gerrymandered this country is when it comes to congressional districts. That's our biggest problem right now. And the reason that came about, because Republicans systematically targeted state legislatures. They went through, they picked up state house seat after state house seat through whatever trick they could. Following, I'll point out, in the path of the NRA, who did that to weaken gun laws in the United States. So if we're going to do this, we have to not just care about the federal office, not just the president, but we have to care about your state representative, your county commissioner, every single elected office that has a say in our day-to-day lives. That's the first trick.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. You know, we're up against tremendous resources that are put into the political system to restrict the system. Like that gerrymandering movement was funded by billionaires. And so and I think for me, because I get frustrated too, brother, but I think what I had to come to terms with was that it's not that people are like ignorant or that people are like lazy, it's that people have checked out because the system seems rigged to them. Like it seems like the system is rigged. And so how do we as activists help young people and people in general to sort of understand? I mean, listen, when after Citizens United, I think that there were even more people who checked out, right? And so what can we do to galvanize, was the question that I'm trying to ask. And I think some of that's about like grabbing people and actually taking them to the polls with you. Some of that's about having young people work the polls, but that's a long, hard climb. There's some of the things that this audience is bringing up requires long, sustained solutions. It took a long time to gerrymander and jack this country up in terms of districts. It's going to take a long time to repair it. It's going to take a long time for us to overturn Citizens United. I mean, these are long-term efforts that we've got to be engaged in. But I think what I had to come to terms with was like, it's not that people are lazy. People are like deliberately checking out because they think the system is rigged.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to add something also to the previous question about young people. I think those of us who are parents, or biological or adopted parents or role models, when we're involved in activities, whether it's economic, political, civic, voting, religious, we need to make sure we take our children with us. I think we cannot leave the scene with a gap in passing on the knowledge to the next generation. And I think we need to look at some of the leaders, I won't name them, of the previous generations who were doing great things, but then you look at the kids and you begin, well, there's a disconnect here, right? So we have this huge reservoir of experience, we generically of a certain generation. So let's start at home. So, you know, I took my 2 daughters to different things, and other guys work in the group take their sons and daughters. Let's just look at ourselves. It's not out there. I tell the young folk in my classes and the guys on the South Side that you are the leaders, you are the future you've been waiting for.
Right.
You are the future they're waiting for. And then we have to link together and walk with them, drag them, teach them, I don't know what else, but take them with us, okay? It's not, to me, a big magical thing. If I think I'm doing something beautiful, whether I'm called or my job, well, take my daughters with me.
Absolutely.
Take their friends with me, you know? And then they'll see that. So when we retire and transition, there won't be this huge disconnect. You can tell the worth of a leader by how their children act in the public realm.
That is an important thing. I think we had the guy in the red hat back there. And while he's getting the mic to him, that is one of the things, you know, a lot of times I'll go to speak to groups and they say, we need role models in our communities. And I say, but you are the role models. Right. The role model is the person that the kid sees every day, not the Oprah Winfrey or the big superstar who comes in once and makes a 10-minute speech. Yes, that's a certain kind of role model. Right. But the role model that really makes the difference, that made the difference to me, was the person I saw every single day. My mama, my daddy, the minister of my church, the neighbors next door. Those were the people who modeled my life. And if you want role models, then you have to be the role model. You have to be the person who says to that young person living next door, here's what you can do, as opposed to waiting for somebody from the outside to come in. It's okay to invite them in, to be inspiration, but the hard work, as all of our panelists say, is done day to day, minute to minute. All right, the man in the red hat.
Yes, my name is Garmin Bell. Let me see, can I condense this? I think you guys mentioned earlier about leaders and things of that nature. I think what we need to look at and understand the struggle. We don't really need a one leader per se. You know, most of you know who Du Bois is, right? And he talked about a thing called the talented 10th, okay? And the talented 10th, kind of like what Emmy Award-winning says, each one teach one, okay? So if we got a lot of leaders, we can move ourselves forward in many areas, because one leader mainly kind of concentrates on one thing, but we got a bigger struggle ahead of us. For example, in America today, we have kind of regressed. Black folks, in terms of young people, they're dropping out of school at a rate uneven heard of. Like 50% of the high schoolers don't graduate.
Can we ask you to get to your question?
Okay, my question is, we need to think about, is this feasible? Look at the struggle of black folks in terms of not just one leader, but multiple leaders, like Du Bois was talking about. And once upon a time, they had a thing called the Chicago Defender. That was like our major national newspaper. We need a platform, because many of our problems don't get heard. And so we need something to be able to get it out to the grassroots people, okay? And the last thing, it's a continuous struggle. It don't stop. As you can see, Martin Luther King died, the struggle didn't stop. So what do you guys think about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that's what we were saying up here, that the model of like that singular male leadership is a model that's mythological historically, and certainly not what young people have embraced. We could talk a little bit more about Du Bois' talented 10th. I mean, you got to understand, Professor Du Bois ultimately rejected his own sort of sense of what the talented 10th was. But I think you're right in the sense that we have to appreciate a model of leadership that's more collective and doesn't look like what we thought it might look like. There are great online resources for grassroots folk to communicate with each other. The Black Agenda Report is one of them. The Griot is another one. There's a lot of, there's a lot of internet and electronic sources, but you're right that we have been seeing diminishing print resources. You will, if you look at the data on dropout rates over the course of the Obama era, though, dropout rates have actually been improving. They have been lessening pretty steadily for the last 6 or 7 years, and I think we have to, as progressive people, we have to acknowledge when things are going right. We're really good at being critical and negative, and everything is jacked up, it's terrible, the world's going to hell, and that's cool to be critical, but we are not as good at as acknowledging the progress that actually gets made.
So now, unfortunately, that had to be our last question because we're out of time, but to wrap up, I'd like for each of you, I always like to leave the audience with one thing they can do when they leave this room that will make a difference in all of these issues that we're talking about today. In terms of Selma to Ferguson, what is it they can do that might help to start the ball rolling for the next 50 years in defining what that is going to be like? And who would like to start?
Sure, I think one thing we can do is to ask ourselves, how are we going to bridge the generational divide? So for older people, which particular person, either my children, my family, or someone in my neighborhood, or someone who's on the block that I pass by when I'm getting gas, how am I going to connect with them on a regular, daily basis? And for young people, how am I going to be intentionally open to connect to someone who's older? Let's make that connection, because part of the reason is that there's a disconnect. Some of the issues I'm hearing, Dr. King was involved in the 1950s, the NAACP was involved in the 1940s, so there's some information, both wisdom and experience, that we can share, but at the same time, there are things that we just don't know that young